What happened when a peaceful Saturday morning turned into a scene straight out of a movie? Daniel Carter, a retired Navy SEAL, had lived in Oak Ridge Estates for only 6 months. The quiet suburbs seemed like the perfect place to start over, far away from the chaos of battlefields and missions. His mornings were simple: a steaming cup of black coffee, the newspaper folded neatly on the table, and the faint sound of birds in the tall oaks that lined his street. But peace, as Daniel knew too well, never lasted forever. At exactly 8:05 a.m., a thunderous pounding rattled his front door. Startled, Daniel set his coffee cup down, the liquid rippling from the vibration. Before he could reach the handle, the door swung open with a violent crash, the lock snapping as if it were paper. Two men in dark tactical-style uniforms stormed inside, their boots heavy against the polished wooden floor. "You're in violation," one of them shouted, waving a clipboard as though it were a badge of authority. Daniel froze, his instincts switching on instantly. He had faced enemies with real weapons in war zones, but never expected to see so-called HOA enforcers barging into his own living room. The men's voices boomed through the house, loud enough for half the neighborhood to hear. Across the street, blinds shifted, and silhouettes moved behind windows. Neighbors peeked out, whispering, curious yet afraid. To them, it looked as if Daniel was under arrest. "What violation?" Daniel asked calmly, his voice steady. He didn't raise his tone, but the steel in his eyes made both men hesitate for a split second. The taller officer jabbed a finger toward the backyard. "That shed of yours, unauthorized, your truck in the driveway. Against policy, your lawn, not compliant with HOA standards." Daniel looked at them, saying nothing. He had risked his life to protect freedoms overseas, and now two self-proclaimed enforcers stood in his living room, treating him like a criminal over grass in a storage shed. "Leave my house," Daniel finally said, his tone even but laced with command, the kind that came from years of leading men into missions where survival depended on every word. But instead of backing down, the men smirked. They scribbled notes on their clipboard, muttering about fines and further action. For the first time since moving in, Daniel realized something every neighbor already knew. Oak Ridge Estates wasn't run by an HOA. It was ruled by one. And if they thought Daniel Carter was going to bow to intimidation, they had chosen the wrong house. The broken lock on Daniel's front door still dangled when the HOA enforcers stepped deeper into his living room. Their presence filled the house like an unwelcome storm. One scribbled furiously on his clipboard, while the other barked accusations as if Daniel had committed a crime. "You've been warned before," the shorter one snapped, though Daniel knew he had never received a single notice. "Your shed violates Section 14, your vehicle violates Section 22, and your lawn doesn't meet the aesthetic standards of Oak Ridge Estates." Daniel stood silently, arms folded, his calm presence unnerving the two men. In combat, silence was often louder than words. He studied them carefully. Their uniforms weren't official police, yet their tone carried the arrogance of authority. The patches on their sleeves bore the HOA logo, not a badge of law, but of power abused. "I've lived here 6 months, Daniel finally said. "No letters, no warnings, and this is not how you handle a neighbor." The taller enforcer sneered. "You'll pay fines or you'll face removal. Rules are rules." Daniel's eyes narrowed. Removal? For a shed and a parked truck? It was absurd, but the menace in their voices told him they weren't bluffing. They had done this before. Outside, neighbors lingered behind half-open blinds. A mother across the street hugged her child tighter as she watched. A man watering his garden shut off the hose and slipped quickly inside. No one came to help. Fear had already taken root in Oak Ridge Estates. Daniel felt a slow burn rise in his chest, not of fear, but of something deeper. Injustice. He had fought for people he didn't even know halfway across the world. And now, in his own home, two men tried to strip him of dignity with threats and false power. He took a step closer, his presence commanding the room. "You've made your point," he said firmly. "Now leave, Saeed." For a moment, the room grew still. The shorter man shifted uncomfortably under Daniel's gaze, but the taller one leaned forward, almost taunting. "This is just the beginning, Carter. We'll be back. And next time, it won't just be about your shed." With that, they turned and marched out, leaving the door cracked and the air heavy with tension. Daniel stood alone in the silence of his living room. The lock was broken, his peace shattered, and the illusion of a fair neighborhood destroyed. This wasn't about lawns or rules anymore. This was about control, and Daniel Carter had no intention of surrendering. The next morning, Daniel stepped outside to repair his shattered front door. The air was unusually heavy, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. From across the street, blinds shifted again, eyes darting away the moment he looked up. People were watching, but no one dared to speak. A woman walking her dog crossed the street abruptly to avoid him. Two teenagers playing basketball in the cul-de-sac stopped and hurried inside when their mother called from the porch. Daniel noticed the pattern instantly. He had seen it before in villages overseas, fear spreading like smoke, invisible but suffocating. He tightened the last screw on the door hinge and stood still, surveying the quiet street. These people weren't just avoiding him. They were afraid of the same men who had stormed into his home. That night, while Daniel read in his living room, a soft knock echoed against the broken frame of his front door. He opened it cautiously and found a young couple standing there. Their faces were pale, their voices hushed. "We don't have much time," the man whispered. Glancing nervously over his shoulder, he slipped Daniel a folded piece of paper. "You're not the only one they've targeted." Before Daniel could ask questions, the couple hurried back across the street, disappearing into their house like shadows. Inside, Daniel unfolded the note under the warm glow of his lamp. Written in hurried handwriting were several names. Families in the neighborhood, each marked with details. Harassed, fined, threatened with foreclosure. Some notes were darker: car towed, false violation, mailbox vandalized. Daniel's jaw clenched as he read line after line. This wasn't a random encounter. The HOA had been systematically intimidating residents, turning their own community into a prison of fear. Suddenly, the whispers and avoidance made sense. These weren't unfriendly neighbors. They were scared neighbors, scared of retaliation, of being the next target, of losing the homes they had worked for their entire lives. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the note trembling slightly between his fingers. He thought of the families across the street, of the kids who should have been riding bikes freely, not peeking from windows. He thought of the oath he had taken years ago, to protect the innocent, to stand against oppression. The HOA had chosen the wrong house. They had shattered his door, but unknowingly opened another. For Daniel Carter, the mission had just begun. The folded note with the neighbors' names lay on Daniel's kitchen table like evidence from a case file. He had read it 3 times already, each word etching itself deeper into his mind. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. They were running the neighborhood like a dictatorship. Daniel sat in the dim light of his living room that evening, the quiet hum of the ceiling fan the only sound. His front door was fixed, but the memory of it being kicked in lingered. It wasn't the door that bothered him. It was the look in his neighbor's eyes. They lived in constant fear, waiting for the next fine, the next threat, the next knock in the night. He leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped together. Years ago, in faraway deserts and cities, Daniel had lived by one unbreakable code: protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Because he hadn't retired from that responsibility. It was still inside him, buried but unforgotten. His phone sat on the table, silent and waiting. Daniel stared at it, hesitating for the first time in years. He hadn't called his Siegel brothers in a long time. They had all gone their separate ways, some retired, some working security jobs, some trying to build out new lives. But the bond they shared wasn't something time could erase. Finally, he picked up the phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found a name he hadn't dialed in almost a decade. With a deep breath, he pressed the button. The line clicked. "Carter?" a gravelly voice answered. "It's me," Daniel said quietly. "I wouldn't call unless it mattered." There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "I figured the day might come. What's going on?" Daniel explained everything. The forced entry, the threats, the intimidation, and the fear that had gripped every family in the neighborhood. The voice on the other end grew colder with each word. "You need us?" the man asked finally. Daniel's answer was simple. "Always." Another pause. Then, "Say when." Daniel hung up, a faint spark of determination lighting in his chest. He wasn't alone anymore. His brothers had faced dangers far greater than this, but this fight was different. This was home. As the night deepened outside, Daniel sat quietly, the note still spread across the table. For the first time since the HOA had stormed into his life, he felt something shift. The board had power, but he had something stronger: loyalty, discipline, and a team that never walked away from a mission. And their next mission was about to begin. 2 nights later, Oak Ridge Estates looked the same from the outside. Quiet streets, porch lights glowing faintly, and neatly trimmed hedges lined in perfect rows. But under that calm surface, something was shifting. 3 black SUVs rolled silently into the neighborhood and parked near Daniel's home. The doors opened, and out stepped men who carried themselves with quiet confidence. Broad shoulders, steady eyes, and the unmistakable presence of warriors who had seen too much to be shaken easily. Daniel's Navy SEAL brothers had arrived. "Carter," one of them greeted, clasping his hand firmly. "Heard you've got a situation." Daniel nodded. "This isn't just about me. It's the whole neighborhood." They sat around his dining table, the note with the neighbor's name spread out in the center. Each man listened carefully as Daniel explained what had been happening. The forced entry, the threats, the intimidation, and the way families lived in silence. No one interrupted. These men understood the weight of fear, and they also understood how to dismantle it. When Daniel finished, one of them tapped the table lightly. "Sounds like an operation. Only difference is we're not crossing borders. We're crossing the street." The others smirked quietly, but their eyes stayed serious. This wasn't on about combat. It was about justice. Later that evening, they drove to the HOA headquarters, a polished office building at the edge of town. Its glass windows reflected the streetlights, giving it an appearance of authority and untouchable control. To most residents, it was a fortress. To Daniel and his brothers, it was just another building. They entered calmly, not hiding, not sneaking. Their presence alone was enough to make the receptionist falter. Daniel requested a meeting with the board immediately. Something in his voice left no room for denial. Minutes later, the SEALs stood inside the boardroom. The HOA board members, dressed in expensive suits, looked up in shock as the veterans walked in. Their usual arrogance faded, replaced by unease. Daniel placed the stack of neighbor complaints on the long mahogany table. His voice was steady, commanding. "This ends tonight. No more intimidation, no more threats. We've documented everything. And if you think fear is your weapon, let me introduce you to men who don't break under pressure." The room fell silent. The board members exchanged nervous glances. For the first time, the power in the room did not belong to them. And Daniel knew bound. This was only the beginning. The silence in the HOA boardroom was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead lights. The board members, once smug and untouchable, now shifted in their leather chairs as Daniel's team stood firm across the table. One of the SEALs, Marcus, placed a small recording device on the table and pressed a button. A red light blinked steadily. "Everything you say from this point forward is being documented," he said coolly. The board's chairman, a gray-haired man in a navy suit, forced a smile. "Gentlemen, this isn't necessary. We're simply maintaining community standards. Our role is—" Daniel cut him off, his voice sharp. "Your role is to serve the community, not to terrorize it. Families are afraid to walk outside. People are being threatened with foreclosure over made-up violations. I've seen dictatorships with less control than you hold over this neighborhood." The words landed heavily. The other board members fidgeted, exchanging nervous glances. Finally, One of them muttered under his breath, "We didn't mean for it to go this far." Marcus leaned forward. "So you admit it's gone too far?" The man swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the chairman. The SEALs watched like hawks, trained to read body language, and they saw the cracks forming. Pressure wasn't new to them, but to the board, it was unbearable. Another SEAL, Torres, opened a folder and slid several photos across the table. They were images Daniel had gathered from neighbors, pictures of vandalized mailboxes, cars mysteriously towed, even a family receiving a foreclosure notice for non-approved flower beds. The photos were damning. The chairman's smile faltered. "These are isolated incidents," he said quickly. "Unfortunate misunderstandings." "No," Daniel replied firmly. He tapped the stack of neighbor complaints. "This is a pattern, and you've been profiting from it." The word profiting made the room tighten like a drawn bow. One of the younger board members shifted uncomfortably, then finally broke. They told us it was standard procedure," he confessed. "Every violation fee, every fine, it goes into a separate account. Not for the community, for them." He gestured subtly toward the chairman and two others. The SEALs didn't move, but their presence pressed harder than any weapon. The truth was spilling out faster now, and there was no stopping it. The chairman's face reddened. "Careful what you accuse us of," he snapped. But his trembling hands betrayed him. Daniel leaned in, his calm voice carrying more weight than a shout. "You can try to intimidate families with fines and threats, but you don't intimidate us. We've faced worse than you on battlefields you couldn't survive for an hour. The difference is we fight for those who can't fight for themselves. And tonight, we fight for Oak Ridge Estates." The room fell into silence once again, but this time the silence wasn't power. It was defeat. The corruption that had ruled the neighborhood for years was finally unraveling. And Daniel knew the final move was coming. The HOA boardroom no longer felt like a chamber of power. It felt like a cage. The once confident board members sat stiffly, their suits rumpled, their eyes darting nervously at the calm, unyielding presence of Daniel and his SEAL brothers. For years, these men and women had ruled Oak Ridge Estates with an iron grip, hiding behind paperwork and fabricated violations. But now, under the watchful eyes of veterans trained to dismantle fear, their empire of intimidation was collapsing. Torres slid the final piece of evidence across the table, a spreadsheet copied from the HOA's own records. It detailed every violation fee collected over the past 3 years. The numbers were staggering, but what stood out most was where the money went. Instead of funding community projects or maintenance, the funds were funneled into private accounts belonging to the board's leadership. Marcus looked directly at the chairman. "This isn't community management. This is theft." The younger board member, who had confessed earlier, buried his face in his hands. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," he whispered. Daniel's voice was steady as stone. "It always goes this far when good people stay quiet. Not anymore." He gathered the files, the photos, and the recordings into a single folder. "The residents will see this. The authorities will see this. Your time of control is over." The chairman tried to stand, puffing out his chest in a last attempt at control. "You can't just walk in here and threaten us. We'll sue." But Daniel didn't flinch. He leaned in close, his words quiet but sharper than a blade. "You stormed into my house, you broke my door, you threatened my neighbors, and you called it authority. That ends tonight. Sue me if you want, but tomorrow morning the truth comes out, and you'll answer to more than me." The man sat back down, defeated. By sunrise, the evidence had been delivered to the county authorities. Several board members resigned immediately, unable to face the scandal. The chairman and 2 others were placed under investigation for fraud, embezzlement, and harassment. The HOA office, once a fortress of fear, was locked and empty within a week. News traveled fast through Oak Ridge Estates. Neighbors who had once hidden behind curtains now stepped outside with cautious smiles. Children played in the cul-de-sac again, their laughter ringing like freedom. Families who had lived in silence now greeted Daniel with gratitude, bringing food to his doorstep, shaking his hand, and thanking him for doing what no one else had dared. One evening, the young couple who had first slipped him the note came by. The man held out his hand, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just save your home, Daniel. You saved all of us." Daniel shook his hand, offering only a small smile. "I didn't do it alone. You all had the courage to speak up. That's what made the difference." Behind him, his SEAL brothers stood quietly, ready to leave as they always had. No need for recognition, no desire for praise. They had answered the call, and now their mission was complete. As the sun set over Oak Ridge Estates, Daniel finally sat on his porch with his coffee, the quiet he had once longed for returning at last. But this time, it wasn't just his peace. It was everyone's. The HOA had ruled with fear, but fear could never outlast loyalty, courage, and truth. And though the neighborhood would heal and move on, the story of the veteran who stood up and the team who stood with him would never be forgotten.